welcome tonight to the library for one of our Wednesday events. We seem to have them serially these days, so thanks for coming.
Thanks for having them.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. You're a good audience. So tonight, it's my pleasure to introduce Cynthia Bittinger. Cindy is an educator and historian, teaches at the Community College of Vermont and the Lifelong Learning Institute of the University of Vermont. She was appointed to the Center for Research on Vermont at the University of Vermont. She's a founding member of the Vermont Women's History Project at the Vermont Historical Society. Her series on Vermont women can be heard on VPR. Is that still being?
Oh yeah, we just
great.
did Women Journalists. I don't know if you heard it in March. It was fabulous. I recruited different journalists who are practicing in Vermont. A reporter from the Burlington Free Press, the woman who started Vermont Woman. It's very good. You can still go online and listen to them.
There's a podcast if you go to vpr.net.
They want to do it forever.
Really, that's great.
Till we drop over.
There's no lack of topics there. Right?
Yeah, right.
So, and she was the executive director of the Calvin Coolidge Memorial Foundation in Plymouth, Vermont for 18 years, and wrote the book Grace Coolidge, Sudden Star, about Vermont-born Grace Goodhue Coolidge, the First Lady from 1923 to 1929. And tonight she'll be talking about her book, Vermont Women, Native Americans, and African Americans Out of the Shadows of History. All right, thank you, Cynthia. It's all yours.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me, Jerry. This is a lovely group, and one of my former students is here, but she says she has to leave early. But still, I want to thank her for coming. She was a student online, so I didn't know what she looked like. I think you put your picture in, though, didn't you?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Some people put their dogs in instead of their picture. And I finally put a halt to that because I've been teaching online for a few years now. I said there'll be no more dogs. You have to put your real face in. But one woman never put her face in this whole semester. And it's hard for me as a teacher because you really do kind of want to reach out and get to know them. I also encourage students to come to some of my talks because I do give a lot of talks. And they do. And I give them extra credit for that too. And I test them. Did you learn anything? So anyhow, by teaching Vermont history for many, many years at Community College of Vermont, I was always pulling together materials, always copying things and making my own textbook. So then when Freedom and Unity came out, I was thrilled. But have you seen Freedom and Unity, the book? Yeah, it's awfully thick. And I really didn't know how to work with it, I have to be honest. And then Jan Albert's book came out, and have you had Jan Albert speak here ever? Perhaps, no? She's the landscape expert in Vermont. And her book was great because she described, obviously, the changes of the land. And most of my students, and I bet you were like this too, Alice, are very interested in landscape, right? So that was perfect. But I didn't feel, and her mission wasn't to do it, that there was a whole lot on women's history, African American history, and Native American history. And even the giant Freedom and Unity didn't have that much. So I said, okay, I think I should do something about this and start pulling together some materials for my students. And if other people like you, nice people, want to hear something about this, that's good too. And since it's basically written for the general public, you should be able to read it. It's not written for a Dartmouth professor to read. It's written for all of us. And most of us are lifelong learners too. I'm certainly a lifelong learner. I was trained at Columbia, but I needed a lot more history than I got there. I was there in 1969. That really dates me. I keep saying to my students, you know, I'm really old. They go, yeah, you are. You were in college when we were born. so yes.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. So basically, I've had to teach myself an awful lot of this history, so I understand that we're all doing this. So I started my book with a poem. We are here, and I was delighted that the Native Americans loaned me so much material. Did you realize they are such a friendly, lovely group in Vermont? They would do anything for me. If I need to have a pronunciation of something, they'll tell me and help me. So they were very kind and helpful people. All right, here's the poem I put in to start with. And they're passing around the book so you can look at it too. As we stand tall, we hold each other's hand. We want you to understand who and what we are. In our body and soul, we are Abenaki Indians. Now, some say Abenaki. Have you heard that? Yep. That's the pronunciation that some natives in Vermont, but not all, so you can't assume that. As we yell, we do exist. Look at us. We are real, inside and out. Put us on your list. We have been brave. We cannot look the other way. We are here to stay. You hear our drums play. We bring peace from our chief who stands proud on our ground that we share. We all breathe the same air. We drink the same water. Our ancestors are still here. If you quit, you can hear them cry. They still want to know why. Can't you accept us? Open your eyes. We are here and stand proud. We are Abenaki, or we are Abenaki. So I thought that was a great way to start the book. I also jumped right in to the captive story to get you to like the book. When you write a book, you want to scare people a little, right? And tell them a really scary story. So I told, my opening is about the captives, Susanna Johnson, who's famous, and her son. And her son actually ended up here, I think, at Brattleboro and Bellows Falls. Yes, Sylvanus. He was well known in the community, yes, after he came back to his parents and came back into the white society. Anyhow, I wanted you to know that there are 4 bands that have now been recognized in Vermont. They weren't all recognized at that point. So I wanted to go over that with you a little bit. The Missisquoi folks are basically in the National Wildlife Refuge area. And that is, as you know, Lake Champlain. And that is basically the magnet or the cultural hub for many, many natives in Vermont. Yet, in 1943, the area was designated a federal property, and they were told to move out. This was about 6,000 acres. So that is one clue why we don't know this Native American history, because part of my introduction to my book is that most of my students wonder what happened. They always say this to me, what happened to the Native Americans? Cindy, you tell us about early settlement, you tell us about the French and Indian War, but then you dropped them. And Jan Albers drops them. She literally does in her book, what's a landscape history? Let's be fair here. But we can't drop them. They are here. So the Missisquoi people are in the Swanton area, and there's quite a bit of evidence. In 1973, a burial site was found dating back 2,000 years. In the year 2000, a burial site was found with artifacts from the 17th century. And this band was recognized last year by the legislature and the governor. I think you're aware of the recognition, right? A little bit? Yes. Coasac, next one on my list. This band...
Can you explain what you mean by recognized?
Oh, okay, sure. Recognition means that the state says you do exist, and it's important, and you can sell your products that are native, and they are recognized as native by the state of Vermont. Getting your products recognized with the federal government is much more difficult. But they went through a whole process, well, we can talk later, but they went through a whole process, the natives, these bands that I'm talking about, to get recognition. They had to prove that they were in Vermont from the end of the glaciers, really, till when they came to Vermont. Remember, North America was settled from west to east. We have to remember that because we snobby Easterners sometimes don't remember that. But it was one of the last places to be settled in America. But still, they had to prove that they were here. They had to prove that they were here enough in large enough numbers to gain recognition. And if you want further information, please go to the different websites that the natives have. And Melody Walker is a friend of mine, and she'd be happy to give you more in-depth discussion. She read my chapter and helped me with sections because I'm such a new scholar on this field. The real experts, though, on Native American history are Colin Calloway at Dartmouth and Margaret the two at UVM. I'm spacing on their names right now. It's in my book, though. Okay. The next group, Coasac, were in Newbury, Vermont, and Haverhill, New Hampshire. They farmed on the meadows of the Coas, and they raised a very unique type of corn. This was a trading center up and down the Connecticut River. This unique corn is now being reestablished in the meadows, and about 58% of this band lives within Vermont's borders. The Coasacs are trying to keep the language going. There were only 2 Algonquin speakers the last time I checked. So learning the language, passing the language on to your children is very much of a priority for many of these folks. Next one, Nelhegan. This is the northeast part of Vermont. The chairman of the State Native American Affairs Commission is in this band. He hopes that they can encourage cultural tourism and teach skills to their children. The Elnu, the last one, is fairly near you folks. They are based in Jamaica near Wardsboro, toward the southern part of Vermont. They focus on practicing traditional crafts such as quill work, wampum, stone carving, weapons, and sewing regalia, and they sing traditional songs, and they organize through the Woodland Confederacy. So I wanted to give you a snapshot of the existing bands, and please pay attention to the press when you hear more about them. They sometimes have gatherings. For instance, they had a gathering up on Lake Champlain and invited me, but they invited everybody to come to it. And they showed me their crafts, and that's where I saw the different labels that they are now able to put on. And they told me that since they can put a state recognition label on, they can charge more. They're very happy about that, by the way. They can charge more. All right. Some of you know that I'm the Calvin Coolidge expert, so let me tell you that Calvin was Native American. Did you know that? No. All right. He did not keep it a secret. Matter of fact, he was proud of it. And his great-grandmother had Native American heritage. Dorcas Eaton. If you go to the cemetery at Plymouth, you can find the grave. I've taken many 4th grade students out there to show them the graves. But this, ironically enough, is Calvin getting a war bonnet from the Sioux. So it's nothing to do with the Abenaki, but it's such a famous picture that I thought it would be fun to show you. And here he is writing his autobiography in 1929 and explaining to the public, after he's left the presidency, that he has Native American heritage. And this was really at the height of discrimination against Native Americans. So wouldn't it have caused a stir? No, it caused no stir. People didn't seem to care. I think if you had asked him earlier if he was Native American, he would have told you. He was very proud of it. He said that one of his aunts smoked a pipe and looked very, very native to him. So he was proud of it. However, there was a strong eugenics movement in the nation, and there was also a eugenics movement in Vermont. And many of my students do not know this. It's news to them, I think, that this happened. The University of Vermont, Harry Perkins, was the one who set this up. And if you go to my book, you can learn something about the reason why. Basically, there was a movement in the late 1920s and 1930s to have better breeding. Have you ever heard of this?
Better
some
breeding?
Of you have. Yes, breeding better Vermonters, better breeding. So if you're going to have better breeding, you obviously have selected people that are going to be great. Now, you guys having trouble seeing, you can hop over here.
Okay. There's 2 spots right here.
Yeah, 2 spots over there. Then we moved everybody over there. Okay. Anyhow, you would have better breeding, and you would look for degeneratives, people who you would call feeble-minded, and you would look to the natives, and you would look to the French Canadians, because that's where the prejudice was. And you would want to have better Yankee stock. So this was what was going on. Now, some of the natives compare this to Germany and Hitler. I don't go that far, but there was sterilization, and if you wanted to leave the Brandon training school, you might agree to sterilization, because that meant you could be released. So it was a very dark chapter, and Native Americans have been interviewed in Vermont, and they have openly said that that is why they hid. They hid from the authorities, they hid from being singled out as natives. And not until this recognition, oh, you did ask me about recognition, why it's important, didn't you ask me that? Mm-hmm. Okay, it's important because some of the natives who are older people now, in their 60s and 70s, said that once the recognition came in, they now have told their children and grandchildren that they're native.
Wow.
Can you believe that? I talked to one older man, he told me that. He said, Cindy, I never admitted we had any Native American heritage at all until the recognition. Then I was willing to share this with my family. So that's a pretty good reason why. And now, in Vermont, when you're interviewed for the census, more and more are coming forward and saying, I'm Abenaki. It's amazing. The other interesting person in this Native American story is Homer St. Francis, because he really didn't put up with the treatment of natives, and he started fish-ins in 1978, 1979 at the Missisquoi River near Swanton. He wanted free fishing licenses and unlimited access to fishing spots. He also wanted to kick the federal government out. He didn't succeed with that one, but still, he became quite famous. And then recent recognition, we have Roger Longtoe on the far left, the Alnu chief, Governor Shumlin, Don Stevens, the Nulhegan chief, and Fred Weisman, who's been working so hard to uncover this history in Vermont for natives, and he's a native himself, to get this story out. And I do think it's an important story. I'd like to hear if do you have any questions on this section before I get to the African American section? Yes?
You mentioned that these are the four groups you showed on the first slide, that they're bands.
Bands, that's what they call
What's the relationship between a band and a tribe?
That's what natives like to use, band, B-A-N-D. They don't say tribe. It must be an old-fashioned term. You have to be very careful with your terms around Native Americans. I was with a Native American on Monday, and someone used the term squaw, and he was outraged. He stood up, he was outraged. He said, that is never used. We never use that term. That is a derogatory term. So I think tribe isn't used very much, it's now bands. However, Indian seems to be okay now. We can use that term.
Do the different bands consider themselves to be part of a larger nation grouping?
Algonquin language, yes.
Algonquin language.
But they have their own dialects, of course. But yes,
Sure.
And since we only have 2 speakers, there's not a lot of speaking going on. Most, are just using English and so on.
Sure.
Or French, because if you do read my book, you'll find that the natives in Vermont were much more comfortable with the French, with the Catholic religion, and with the French language. So there was much more gravitation to Canada and the French heritage than there was to the English. Too much arguing with the English. Too much bloodshed with the English. Yes, sir?
So Algonquin and Abenaki, is that the language groups?
Yes, Abenaki would speak the Algonquin language, yes. And also, when you read my book, you'll see that Gordon Day was the one who researched and wrote down an alphabet and was able to pretty much get enough material on the language so somebody could learn it differently. Do you know what I mean? If you have the alphabet, if you have a book explaining it to you, this is more helpful. And he wanted to do this so that he could bring this breakthrough. He could keep the language going if he could write it down. Because remember, it wasn't a written language. This was an oral tradition. Stories were passed down. I hope you have some Native American speakers come in here. Have you had anyone yet come in? No, you can have them come here. They're happy to speak. It was an oral tradition and storytelling tradition. So writing it down was not something they did. But the British people with British heritage did move along, and French heritage, and did copy down the stories and start writing things, because that really has to be done if you're going to pass things along. I think. But that's probably my view of things. Okay. My next section was the African American history, and I couldn't get over all the firsts in Vermont. First college graduate, first ordained minister. I couldn't get over all the firsts. And when I gave a talk over in Springfield, one of the men said, "You better write that down." He said, "None of my friends are going to believe any of this Vermont history." So I did. At the end of my chapter, I wrote down all the firsts that I found in Vermont that have been documented. Some are national firsts, and some are just firsts for Vermont, and that's nice. But the national firsts really impressed me. Why was Vermont the first to ban slavery in its constitution? There you have a very enlightened decision. I argue with the other historians. They seem to think that indentured servitude is slavery. I'm sorry. It is not slavery. Indentured servitude, you know you can buy your way out. You'll get out of it eventually. But they seem to, every time I say that the Constitution banned slavery, they say, "Oh, no, there was indentured servitude." Okay, so I'm making clear to you that this isn't a total agreement on how we interpret the Constitution. But it was a very enlightened Constitution. And at the time period, the people, and this is where I win my point, I think, but I'd like to hear from you folks. At the time period, people knew that Vermont banned slavery. Isn't that good enough? It was interpreted that way by the people of that time, that this was a state that did not have slavery. Good enough, I think. Okay, so the Constitution is very important. All right, I'm jumping to Lemuel Haynes. How many of you have heard of him? Wait, you have a question?
Yeah, just a question. So it was an enlightened sort of doctrine, like the people, when they wrote the Constitution in Vermont,
Yes.
thought that slavery was morally wrong.
Yes, absolutely. The leaders felt that totally. Yeah.
What year was that?
1777 is the year. Okay, so Lemuel Haynes, I think, and nobody seems to have heard of Lemuel? No? Yeah, well, a few have, okay. From Rutland. He is a lot of fun to study because he was the first ordained minister. I really liked reading his history. I went over to the Rutland Historical Society, went through their archives. He was born in 1753. He was abandoned by his parents. He was educated by a white family who raised him in Granville, Massachusetts. He was treated well, but he was an indentured servant. He studied very, very hard. He was given an exam by a group of ministers and granted ordination. In 1785, he was the first African American in this country to be ordained. Now, he wasn't in Vermont yet, but he gets to Vermont. Here's a wonderful WPA drawing of him. Obviously, he was a hero in the Depression to some people. Why did they bother drawing Lemuel Haynes unless he was a hero? And he was a hero. He fought in the American Revolution. He wrote poems about the freedom in America. He toured New England. He spent time with Samson Occam, which I found very interesting because at this point I live in Hanover, New Hampshire, so I know about Samson Occam because there's Occam Pond and Occam Ridge and all that, even though new research has shown that maybe Samson never even got up there. He might have stayed in Connecticut. But he was well known because he was the first Native American to write in English his autobiography. So he was very, very well known. Lemuel Haynes was a very popular minister in Rutland. He was probably the only African American in the congregation, and I love this slide of, can you see this okay? Yeah. Of the, here he is preaching, and it's a majority white audience. There were only about 250 blacks even in the region when he was there. He was chosen as the main speaker in Rutland for the 25th anniversary of American independence. Now, he wouldn't have been chosen because he was African American. We might do stuff like that today, affirmative action or something. He was chosen because he was the best minister at the time in Rutland and had the most to say. And his speech, if you ever get a chance, you should try to read it. I I don't think it's on the internet yet. It was in the archives. But he exhorted his listeners to destroy distinctions among men that ought never to exist, because the Constitution mandated that all men are born equally free and independent. But he did praise George Washington, a slaveholder, because he felt George Washington had devoted himself to the nation, and that was important. Remember, this is 60 years before the Civil War that he's talking. So I thought he was very important to write about. And in my book, I highlighted activists, change agents. I didn't want to do a history of victims. And so you'll see that that was my approach to things. I thought that would be much more inspiring. And I've learned a lot from teaching women's history, that you don't really want to go that other route. Okay, my next person that I wanted to share with you tonight is Martin Freeman. Here he is, as an older fellow. But he's the one who decided that he really felt you had to go to Africa if you're going to exist as a black man and have a family. You will not empower yourself till you get to Africa and you're with your people. That was his philosophy. And I think I have his dates there, so you can see. Wait a minute. There, yes, see, he's pre-Civil War with his thoughts, but he's also in history during the Civil War. He was the third generation black Vermonter. He was born in 1826. He was a grandson of a soldier from the American Revolution, who had fought in the American Revolution. He was tutored by a local clergyman for entrance to Middlebury College in 1845. Of course, Alexander Twilight, who I'm not going over tonight, but he's in my book too, had already gone to Middlebury. But Martin Freeman must have done very well. He was the class salutarian. But another graduate noticed when they started marching for graduation that no one had marched near him. So J.H. Gregory, a white student, grabbed his arm and they became lifelong friends, which is kind of a sweet story. So Freeman was asked to teach at Allegheny Institute, one of the early black colleges in the nation and located near Pittsburgh. So this made Freeman the first black professor at any college in the United States. All right, Vermont, there you got a first right there. First college. He was immersed in this intellectual world, but he still called for going to Africa. He thought that would be better. He felt he could achieve neither freedom nor equality in America, no matter what he did. And he saw in Pittsburgh that blacks were often insulted on the street. So even though he had had a fairly ideal life in Rutland, he really, really didn't worry about this. He was appointed Avery College's president, but he didn't like those types of duties, and he once again took off. So they did leave, they did go to Monrovia. He did come to Vermont occasionally to raise money, and for health reasons he came back. The Civil War was raging in 1863, and many felt that he should come back, but he said, no, I'm going to the land of my ancestors. So I think he made a very, very interesting decision, and he was a very, very bright person. So I wanted to share that with you. All right, I'm skipping around a little bit because I can't read my whole book for you tonight. You know, that's too much. Nettie Anderson, her nickname's Nettie. I was just in Shoreham, where she was, and told the Shoreham people about Nettie Anderson. I also talked about her brother, Will. Both of them are in my book. I really feel they should put a marker up. I told them that. Historical societies should put markers up. I think they should take an interest in some of these topics. William Anderson left Virginia after the Civil War. He was a freed slave. He met a Union soldier returning to Vermont and came to Vermont. He started farming and married Philomene Langlois, a Canadian immigrant of French and Native American heritage. So Nettie is ideal for the cover of my book because she's African American, she's French, and she's Native American. I love this. So she made the cover. This one made the cover. Plus she's cute. Her. So she was a very bright child, and you could go to Northfield Seminary for young ladies. back in those days. She was born in 1874. Oh, I have that. And she went there and she flourished. She did go into the diploma course, and about half of those who would go to Northfield, now it's Northfield, Mount Vernon, would go on to college. Well, she went on to college. So she was the first African-American woman to attend Middlebury College. And then, when she did so well there, she was the first African-American woman to be inducted into the National Honor Society Phi Beta Kappa. So there's a first, a national first for this one. And Middlebury comes into my book quite a bit. It's interesting that Middlebury had very enlightened policies. UVM too, because George Washington Henderson was the top of his class at UVM. So UVM, of course, was important as well. Here she is with her girlfriends. You can kind of see who she is, I hope. There she is. And she did, as I said, she did quite well at Middlebury. She wrote the class ode, which they sang on graduation day. She gave an address at graduation day. And at commencement, and this is 1899, all the townspeople came out, and she led the parade that day. Kind of important, I think. She was promised by a Shoreham doctor, because I mentioned she came from Shoreham, that if she graduated first in her class, she would get a cash prize. And this, he did. He gave it to her. The local newspaper never mentioned her race. So she broke a lot of barriers for women. She did go on to teach in New Orleans. She married a very educated man, Walter Lewis Smith. She stopped teaching. Unfortunately, she had a very short life. She died in 1922 at age 47 from cancer. But I feel that she's important to mention, and as I said, her brother goes on to serve in the legislature. So there's quite a lot of history there. And this is why small historical societies are so important. The Shoreham Historical Society has saved all this history about her for people like me to look at. It's wonderful. All right, I put down a few firsts for you. Lucy Terry Prince, I think Gretchen Holbrook Gersina has spoken here. Jerry told me that. Yeah.
And we do, I think, have her
Her book?
talk. Well, we have a book, and her talk is on demand as well.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay. She's a friend of mine, and Lucy Terry Prince is just a wonderful story. And I have her down as her first as well. And then I have Lemuel Haynes, Alexander Twilight. How many of you have been to Brownington? I know it's far for you guys, but come on. Sometime you can get in these cars and go to these places. If I do it, you can do it. I went to Brownington, and it's a marvelous village where Alexander Twilight had his school. And everything's still there. You can go look at it. They've built an education center now, too. So I do encourage you to do that, to go to Brownington if you could. And this story about African American history is so important today. Did you realize that last year the Somalian students left Burlington High School and Winooski High School and went on strike? Did you know that? Nobody knew. Okay, you guys didn't know because you're pretty far away from Burlington, I know. They went on strike because they said there was not enough black history in their courses, and they felt they were marginalized to ESL classes. So now, after the strike, unfortunately, when you go on strike and do things like that, you get attention. I say unfortunately because it's too bad it can't happen in a more peaceful way. But anyhow, they got attention, and now Burlington is studying racial issues and promises them to improve the curriculum so that they are happy. But look how angry they were. They went to the State House and met with legislators, yes.
You just said you wished it happened in a more peaceful way. Was it not peaceful?
Well, they walked out of class.
Yeah.
Was it?
But they were peaceful, all right, no civil disobedience. But I mean, I'm sorry it took that extremism to get action. It's too bad, you couldn't just sit in the library and talk
And
to
was
each
it
other.
Somali? You said Somalian. Who was?
Mainly Somali students,
Okay.
Somalian students, yeah. Yes, ma'am.
I can say that this plight is true probably today, I don't know, but throughout Vermont, because I raised 2 interracial children in the middle, in a state in the middle of, in a town in the middle of the state, and none of this did my kids ever. So have you gotten into the elementary schools and the high schools?
I've given some talks to elementary school teachers, but I'd like to give more. They have to invite me. When I was up at Rokeby, do you know, how many of you have been to Ferrisburg and Rokeby? You've been to a lot. Okay.
She did speak here.
Oh, you had Jane
Executive,
Williamson
yes.
speak here? All right, her Underground Railroad exhibit is opening this summer, so really I encourage you to go up. I just saw Jane. But it's important to see evidence of what went on in Vermont history, and you can do that by going to Rokeby. Yeah, you can see the evidence of the Underground Railroad. So I encourage you to do it. And I think the students should go out. These students aren't very far from Rokeby. They could go on a field trip there, now that there's a big exhibit. Okay, so that was basically my African American research. I'd love to improve my book. I'd love to add more to it. If you have stories that I've missed, please tell me. I'm happy to bring more material in. But still, I feel it's very important to share this history. Okay, the women's story. Now, I sprinkled women throughout the Native American part and the African American part. But then when I got to the women's story, I must say I dropped them because I felt I should explain to my reader about patriarchy, about the lack of legal rights, the need for women to rebel. I had to go, I'm sorry, I had to do that. I had to drop the Native American history and the black history to a degree. I start out with a little on Native Americans to get you sort of feeling romantic about how great they were. My students love that section. They say, oh, those women, they had a wonderful time swimming with their babies on their backs and stuff. But still, I felt I had to teach this section. So I jumped in. Of course, this is Anne's story with her gun. She's the one most of you do know about, right? Anne's story, anybody know about her? No? All right, Anne's story's the one who, when her husband died, she could just man her gun, take care of her kids, shoot Tories, whatever it took in the American Revolution. She was quite a strong woman, and most people love her story, and usually have 1 or 2 students every semester that want to study Anne's story. And I keep saying, oh, but we know so much about Anne's story. Can't you find somebody else? But still, she's important because she represents this Yankee, strong woman, I can do it all, that was passed down in Vermont history of these very strong women. And then, on the other hand, though, look at the legal restrictions and the cultural restrictions those strong women had, just like everybody else who's a woman. Okay, I was very, very wild here because I picked Axel Sprague and Mother Ann Lee as rebellious figures to start on my women's section. Do you realize how wild this is? You're not thinking it's wild. It's very wild to choose someone from the Shakers and a spiritualist to start your section on women's history. Is that irreverent or what? I mean, really, it was wild. My book's been reviewed over and over, and nobody's really picked up on that. They didn't get it. This was to really slap your face, wake you up, that you had to be that extreme to be different in Vermont. You had to be a spiritualist, you had to be a Shaker to be different. Anyhow, Axel Sprague was born in 1827, sorry. Here she is as a young girl. If Calvin Coolidge had not been born in Plymouth, Vermont, she would have been the most famous Vermonter from Plymouth, Vermont. Did you realize that? No, you didn't know how famous she was. She was extremely important speaker. She went all over the northern states speaking. She had had a tough life. She was sixth child in her family, ruled by an alcoholic father. She attended her town's one-room schoolhouse. She did so well, she eventually was the teacher. But I should explain to you, young women of age 13 were the teachers in Vermont in this time period. So it wasn't so strange that she's a teacher, eventually becomes a teacher. But if you were bright, that was the only thing you could do, was teach at your school. You couldn't do it. No other avenue, no other profession was open to you except teaching. Maybe a little nursing, helping, Not even really nursing, because even during the Civil War, women couldn't be nurses. They had to have male nurses. Okay, so she decides that even though she's had crippling rheumatoid arthritis, she was confined to her house for 7 years, that she is going to rise above this. So angelic powers transform her in 1854. You got this? Why she's a spiritualist? Yeah. The powers transformed her, and she began her mission as a trance medium and lecturer. She started in South Reading in 1854. She was mainly self-educated. She has a diary, and if you go on the internet, you can read page after page of her poetry, her writings. Her works have really been transcribed for the internet. You can read a lot. She recovered, and as I said, she was a spiritualist. She filled the halls in Boston. She was urged to go to Michigan, Baltimore, Philadelphia, the Midwest. She had 88 requests in 1 year to speak, 1860. Men especially loved her. Now, why did men love her if they were happy to have the patriarchy and have women behave? They loved her because she didn't care. She was willing to be looked at, willing to dress in a flamboyant manner. Remember, she was in a trance, so she could do anything. So she was very exciting to men and women. She was quite an orator, and she was a role model for people who liked independent women. Money was not her goal, but she made a lot of money. And she then went on to take up the cases of inmates in prisons. She even went to prisons to talk. She went to the Charlestown State Prison and insisted on meeting with the female prisoners. She was one of the first to blame the social scheme and evils of liquor, not criminals, for the situations. And she wrote poetry to denounce slavery and pleaded for emancipation of slaves long before the Civil War. So her history continued on even though she died at age 34 in 1862. And if you go to Plymouth, you can find her grave. I complained so much to the town cemetery commission that the grave was falling apart, so they made a new one for her, which is nice. And on it, you will see, "I still live." Are you getting it? She's getting it. I still live. So I once again used to take the 4th grade students out there and show them her grave and tell them a little bit about her history and how empowered she was as a woman. All right.
Pronounce your first name again.
Axa Sprague. Now you could say Aisha Sprague too, but I knew an Axa in Plymouth, so I figured it's Axa. That's how
What kind of name is that?
old Yankee name.
Is it Yankee name? It's not biblical?
Could be. I don't know. You got me on that one. I'm not sure. But Axa was a friend of mine and wonderful lady. Anyhow, the other very important woman who was highlighted by David McCullough in his last book is Emma Willard. And Emma Willard, of course, was born in Connecticut, but she did come to Middlebury in 1807 and married John Willard. And she started a school there in 1814 for females to board and learn scientific and classical subjects at a higher level, similar to what was taught at Middlebury. So she was the first woman in the country to teach science and math to women. Remember, the feeling was women couldn't learn these things. They weren't smart enough to learn these things. And they wouldn't want to learn these things. Okay. She declared that she wanted instructions for women because they needed to be moral and religious, literary, domestic, and sometimes ornamental. She justified the need for education, because remember how early this is. She's the first one in the country talking about this. She justified it that you would be a better mother, because you could teach your sons, all kinds of things, and your daughters too, but mainly your sons. So therefore, you would need to be more educated. Now, it was a good angle she had there. She wrote a pamphlet in 1819. Remember, these are very early years here, to explain her philosophy, a plan for improving female education. She tried to raise money for this. Her school in Middlebury was thriving and growing, but she kind of knew Vermont was a conservative state. and she wanted to find a more enlightened area, so she looked to New York. So in 1819, a believer in her efforts convinced the governor of New York to read her proposal, and he urged the legislature to support her and develop a school for women. Of course, the men in the legislature refused. They cited concerns that education would harm women's health, create intellectual competition among the sexes, and disturb the social order. But she still went over to Troy, and she founded the Troy Female Seminary, which she ran from 1821 to 1838. She educated hundreds of women, and the women went out to start their own schools, because that's what happens when you educate women. We see this in Africa today. Once you educate some, it just keeps snowballing. So her women's network stretched from New England into the Deep South. So she had a tremendous influence on women's history and did spend some time in Vermont. My next couple, the Robinsons. And this is where I mentioned Rokeby, because these two are the ones at Rokeby. And during definitely the time of slavery, you have in Rokeby, the Robinsons are rescuing slaves, having slaves come and live there. And Vermont, of course, is famous for its stand. There are female abolitionist societies all over the state. Matter of fact, they were in Bellingham, Norwich, Weybridge, Waitsfield, Cornwall, and Randolph. And I looked through the notes from the Norwich one, because I live right near Norwich, and could find that they raised a lot of money to send materials to slaves who had escaped to Canada. That was one of their goals. They taxed themselves a cent a week so that they could save money to help escape slaves. So it was a very important movement. And these two, of course, were in the anti-slavery movement in Vermont, both of them.
I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
If there was no slavery in Vermont,
Yes.
then why didn't slaves escape to Vermont?
They
Why did
did.
they go even farther away?
They did. Many came to Vermont and stayed in Vermont and worked in Vermont, were above ground, and so on. But many said, I'm too scared. A slave holder will come and get me. I'm too scared. And some would have letters sent from the slaveholder saying, I do want to retrieve James, or whatever. And they just felt safer getting over that border to Canada than they felt they were out of reach totally of these slaveholders. But most knew that they'd be okay in Vermont. But still, they did usually continue on to Canada. Because as the Robinsons, they have a lot of materials, letters slaves wrote, and in those letters, some of the slaves say, sometimes they wrote to her and she said, they're just shaking, they're shaking. They feel they have to keep going. They're too nervous, because also you have the Compromise of 1850, when you were supposed to give up your slaves if you had any and you were in the North. Of course, Vermont turns up its nose on that and says it won't do it. And many of the states said they wouldn't do it. And you can see as this country grew heading toward civil war, because when states say, I'm not going to do it, I'm not going to obey the federal law, one judge said, you would need a bill of sale from God Almighty to return the slave to you. Pretty stern stuff. Yes, Jerry?
But wasn't there the fugitive slave law?
Yes,
that
that's what
was
I'm
passed?
referring to.
Yeah,
That Vermont thwarted, said, we're not doing this.
right, which Abraham Lincoln actually supported.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. There's a film that's just been out called The Abolitionists. Have any of you seen it on PBS? Yeah, you got.
Film.
You have it here?
Yeah, we will have it.
Yeah.
But actually, two of the people who are the sort of talking heads of the film, John Stauffer and Menashe Sinka, did speak here at the library. Stauffer just spoke here in March.
Wonderful.
And that, actually, Maria filmed him, and it's a wonderful talk on BrownGrowTV.org on demand. You can actually stream that.
Yeah, so you can get a good history.
But we will have the abolitionists in the library.
And I was proud of my book because I do mention that William Lloyd Garrison was in Vermont, and I mentioned that Frederick Douglass was also in Vermont, even though during one of his visits they threw, I don't know if they threw stones, they were just mean to him or rowdy. And that happened often
Do you know where he was? Because we were trying to figure out if he ever came to Brattleboro. I asked John Stopper that, and he didn't know for sure.
I have it in here, yeah, I do.
Well, that's okay. You don't have to.
All right, well, we can look it up, but it is in my book. As far as Douglass did travel in Vermont, and he sometimes was well received and sometimes not. And that happened with all these radicals. You realize, once you see that abolitionist movie, you do realize it. You realize that any of these causes can work people up. Axis Sprague didn't seem to work too many people up because she's a spiritualist. And remember, she's in a trance, so nobody's mad at her. But when you get into these causes, abolition, all those women have sent all those petitions to Congress, and then to hear in that series, Jerry, that those petitions were locked in a closet. The Southerners wouldn't let those petitions be seen. And those women went from town to town on horseback or in carriages to get those signatures. It gets you kind of mad, right? That they were gagged. They were gagged. You couldn't do it. Anyhow, so the next movement that was very strong in Vermont and in the nation was the temperance movement. You can't see this slide too well, but Waterman was the artist here. Thomas Waterman Wood, to get his full name for you. And the Wood Gallery in Montpelier was so nice to me. They loaned me all these paintings. I told them I had no budget. So they said, you don't? I said, no. So they said, you can have them. It's fine. So I did get these paintings. So I have many of the Thomas Waterman Wood paintings in my book, and they're lovely. He did a beautiful job. He painted figures in a sympathetic way, and he was the first to paint African Americans in a sympathetic way, and he was a part-time Vermonter. He grew up in Vermont. This woman is scolding the bartender for allowing her husband to drink, and that's her husband on the ground there, drunk, falling down, drunk. And the temperance movement was the most popular movement that the women could have because it was religious, it was acceptable, because remember, your husband never drank. It was the guy next door who was the drunk, right? Your husband was fine. It was those guys that were drinkers. So women, religious women would visit homes, would ask for pledges, ministers would help them, and it was quite acceptable to be in the temperance movement, so it was very popular. When Calvin Coolidge does become president, some people said, well, why did he support prohibition? Why would he not support prohibition? He came from Plymouth. He came from a town where the women were involved in temperance work. He knew how important temperance was to women. Also, my students keep reminding me, men could go to saloons to drink. Women were not allowed to go to any saloons to drink. So my students keep reminding me, you know, the women couldn't even get it, Cindy. Okay, couldn't get it either. So that's true. You have to add that in. And in Norwich, they set up a temperance fountain. The Women's Christian Temperance Union built a fountain. And this fountain is still there. I think that little faucet, though, is for the doggies to get drinks now. But anyhow, on the back of this fountain, it says, water is life. And the feeling was that if you could drink water, you would not drink alcohol, right? I got you all convinced? Yeah. Okay. So that was the feeling at the time period. All right, here's your big star, Clarina Howard Nichols. How many of you have heard of her? Some haven't. Come on, this is your. Well, she's actually from Townsend. Is that too far away for you? Too far away for most of you. What? You go by it every day?
I drive by the market every day.
Oh, okay. Okay. Clarina Howard Nichols. What can I say? She was the first well-known female leader for reform on women's issues. Now there is a book on her by Lynn Blackwell, and I think one other woman helped write that too. Clarina grew up in West Townsend. Her family raised her to be an excellent housekeeper, a frugal housewife, but her first marriage was a disaster, and even though she had several children, she did want a divorce, and that's when she figured out the legal system was not set up for that. She was the first woman to speak in front of the Vermont legislature in 1852. She was editor of your newspaper, Windham County Democrat. She wanted women to vote in school meetings. She wore bloomers on the streets of Brattlebone. And this is not Clarina, but isn't that wild, those bloomers? I mean, really? And Amelia Bloomer was one of her friends. That's where the name came from. Of course, bloomers are terrific because the women could do more without those very restrictive dresses and whalebones and so on. They could do more with the bloomers. But Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony tried to wear bloomers. Their kids made fun of them. Everybody made fun of them, so they went back to the dresses. Did you hear that? Yeah, they gave up on the bloomers. Of course, if women got the vote, this is the way it would be for men, right? You have, she's going off to vote, and he's left with the babies, and of course they're crying, right? Because he doesn't know what to do to help them not cry. So. And it could even get worse. Look at this. She's coming back after voting, and look what he's done. He's burning food. The kids are hitting each other. This one's crying. I mean, that's the way it's going to be if you have women with a vote, right?
She's wearing bloomers.
She's wearing her bloomers, right? I mean, really. The total, if you get the vote, the roles will be reversed, and it's going to just be terrible for men. And she actually started to even look like a man at that point, right? That's another negative. And then they had the sign, "God bless this happy home." For you. Okay, even so, you have another big star, Annette Parmalee. Have you heard of her? Mm-hmm. No. All right, come on. This group needs education here, I can see. She was really your next big hit because she started the Vermont Suffrage Association. She pushed for the vote in municipal elections just like Clarina had done. This was finally obtained in 1917 for tax-paying women. She figured it out. If a woman's paying taxes, can't she vote? So that was a good angle. That was her angle. She presented many arguments in support. As you can see this poster for Randolph. When she was there, she said, women are fast emerging from ignorance into knowledge, from slavery to near freedom, from impotence to power, due to Christianity and education. She said women could be lawyers, doctors, managers of hospitals. Are you hearing how advanced she is here? Yet she focused on the home where there should be equal power. Now listen to this threatening statement. Equal rights mean equal responsibility, equal justice to working men and women, equal pay for women to that who do equal work to men. We're still not there. Still women are not at equal pay. Then she had this brilliant idea. She wanted Vermont to be the 36th state to ratify the 19th Amendment, which gives the right to women. We call it the Susan B. Anthony Amendment. So she went all through Vermont trying to convince the legislators to call a special session. But Governor Clement would not do it. And in 1919, he vetoed the proposal. So Vermont didn't make any of the history books. Tennessee's in all of them. Did you realize it was Tennessee that gave women the right to vote? Vermont could have been there, and she kept saying that to people. Vermont could be here. She was so right. That must have gotten her so frustrated, right? But anyhow, so that's your other big star. Now I'm jumping a little bit to Dorothy Thompson, because I've written quite a bit about Dorothy and Grace Coolidge, of course, both of them. How many of you have heard of Dorothy Thompson? Let's try that. No. All right, she was a very, very famous journalist. Matter of fact, she was almost as famous as Eleanor Roosevelt in her time period. I know that's shocking for all of you. She had a very obscure beginning. She was born in Lancaster, New York, to a poor Methodist minister and his wife in 1893. When the other children came along, the funds were stretched very tight, and Dorothy's grandmother stepped in to prevent a fourth child. The potion she administered to her daughter was deadly. Dorothy was now motherless. Her mother died from that potion. So her own mother died from a botched abortion. So that radicalized her a bit, I think you could say. She clashed with her father's second wife, was sent to live with 2 aunts in Chicago. But that was where she got the encouragement to go to junior college and then Syracuse University. In 1914, she began her career campaigning for suffrage in Buffalo, New York. Then she took a ship to Europe to begin her career in journalism. She wrote in Vienna for the Public Ledger. She also sort of hooked herself up with some Zionists, so she learned a lot about Jewish life and their philosophy. When the Public Ledger merged with the New York Evening Post, she really became the queen of the Overseas Press Corps. She was the first woman to head a foreign news bureau. She impressed Europeans very, very much. And then she met Sinclair Lewis. Now, how many of you have heard of Sinclair Lewis? All right, everybody, okay. It's interesting because Sinclair Lewis was so jealous of his wife, Dorothy Thompson, and because she became so famous, he said, you know, people will only remember you, they'll never remember me. And it's so interesting when I give my talks. Nobody remembers Dorothy Thompson, and everybody remembers Sinclair Lewis. So he had that one wrong. Okay, they fell in love, they left their spouses in 1927, they toured around England on their honeymoon, and they were like these big stars. Everybody was taking pictures of them, newsreels of them, whatever. The Vermont part of the story comes in when they go to Barnard, and Sinclair Lewis says, well, let's buy 2 farms. They buy the Conant Place and the adjacent Chase Farm, and they create twin farms. How many of you have heard of twin farms? Right, a few, okay. It's a very famous resort. For those of you who have millions, you will be going there someday. Michael Jackson used to go there, okay? I got to see twin farms. I called the owner and said I was doing a story for Vermont Public Radio, which was true, and could I go? So I drove up. I had to push all the little buttons. They gave me the code on the fence, and the fence opened up and everything. It's very secretive. And then they gave me the tour, and it was nice. I didn't think it was that fancy, but it's very secluded, and you have swimming, and it's sort of old-fashioned fun, I think.
And where is it?
In Barnard. Up above Silver Lake. Up, you're not supposed to know where it is. You know what I mean?
Oh my God. I did.
But you can travel up there, and if you see the gates, then you'll know you're there. There's no signs. They don't really want you to know. Okay? I found the gates, and then I was in there. Okay. So this was 300 acres in Barnard, and this was their summer retreat. And when Dorothy got into it, she really wanted to save Vermont farms. She had already spoken out from 1934 to 1946 on international affairs. She was on the air for 15 days in 1939 describing the Hitler-led invasion of Europe. She tried to awaken Americans to how serious the European scene was. And when she was over in Europe, before the World War II had started, she interviewed Hitler, and she thought he was pathetic. And she started writing about him, and Hitler heard about this, and she was shipped right out of the country. She was one of the first people just out of here. She wasn't mistreated, and she was just, you pack up your stuff, you're out of here. Because she was trouble. She was trouble. Both Dorothy Thompson and Grace Coolidge worked on refugee issues. Here is Dorothy talking to some girls at Smith College. And she's telling them there should be Lend-Lease. In other words, she's supporting the run-up to World War II. Remember, we look back and we know World War II happened. These folks don't know World War II is going to happen. Pearl Harbor hasn't happened yet. So she's talking up why we should have Lend-Lease, why we should support the British. Look at their faces. Quite a variety, right? Some people agree with her. Some people are very scared of her. It's quite a group, because this was in the Smith College archives, because they're not sure about this lady and her radicalism. But it's important, and if they had listened to Grace Coolidge with her Northampton Rescue Committee and Dorothy Thompson with her massive effort to rescue refugees, Anne Frank might have been saved. Did you know Anne Frank wrote letters to Americans and asked to be saved? Yes, they've uncovered that research. And Dorothy Thompson and Grace Coolidge were very unpopular. This was not a popular stand to be in favor of rescuing the children. But both of their requests were folded into the Wagner-Rogers Act of 1939, And that was a request for 20,000 Jewish children to be brought over to America. And that was too much for Congress, too much for everybody. There was a depression. Why would America be bringing in other children when we have starving children ourselves? So they turned their backs. They did. But these two, I think there should be humanitarian on both of their markers. Did you realize Grace Coolidge has a marker in Burlington? Because she was a first lady before she did this. And Dorothy Thompson has a marker in Barnard. And I would like to put a little addition, humanitarian, because this is relatively new research that I have done with some of my Jewish buddies. And this wasn't known very much when those markers were put up. But I think it's an important addition. So here's a picture of Grace. She is a very interesting lady. You have to invite me back if you want me to give that talk, because it's a whole book that I wrote on Grace. So. And here is where Dorothy Thompson saved Silver Lake. She was a preservationist. She had so much money. In those days, you were well paid as a writer. Sinclair Lewis gets the Nobel Prize, remember? She is very well paid for all her columns. So she has plenty of money. So she just buys the land and gives homes to Jewish refugees, as many as she can bring over. She especially focuses on artists, playwrights, brings as many as she can. And she even at one point bought half of the downtown of Woodstock, Vermont, just because she figured they would wreck it. So she figured that, well, they could have. So she decided, I'll just buy that and make sure it's okay. So she bought that. So she was quite a preservationist. And the other person is Grace Coolidge. She donated the homestead to the state of Vermont and urged them to buy the birthplace of Calvin Coolidge. And Grace died before all that could be done, so her son John continued on his parents' wishes, his mother's wishes really, to save the homestead, and eventually the whole little village of Plymouth was saved. Mainly John Coolidge and the state of Vermont worked on that together. So I would credit both these women with their preservationist philosophy. So that's a little bit from my book. I hope I didn't wear you out. Oh, fascinating. So you have questions, comments? Yes?
Did you include Daisy Turner?
Oh, I sure did. I have Daisy in there. Daisy is one of the well-known African Americans. She was the daughter of a slave. So she has quite a story, and she lived such a long time. She was in the Springfield area, and she lived to, I think, 103. And when she was ailing in the Springfield convalescent home, who visited her but Governor Madeline Kuhn, right? And sang Happy Birthday to Daisy. So Daisy was a class act. And Jane Beck, who did a lot of research on Daisy Turner's history and was at the Vermont Folklife Center, Jane Beck's book will be out soon. They're searching for a publisher right now. I don't know where that stands, but Jane really has made it her life's work. When you all say, those of you who are knowledgeable about this, at least for 20 years, she's been researching Daisy Turner. And Daisy carried on a lot of the songs and poems from those slave days, so that we have them today. So it's quite marvelous. But yes, I did put Daisy Turner. I knew she was well known, and I was tending towards choosing people who weren't well known, but everyone I spoke to said I had to put her in the book, so I did. And the more, and what I should tell you this, when I went to a conference called Black New England a few months ago, they heard about my book, and they walked me down the aisle and said, here's one of Daisy Turner's relatives. So that was kind of fun. I met her. It was fun. Yes,
I
Jerry?
wonder if you could tell a little bit of the story of Lucy Terry Prince and Rhodesia Prince.
Well,
Just an incredible...
well, basically, she was a slave too. She was brought over as a little girl and lived in a family, and she was sort of a barmaid. But
in Deerfield.
In Deerfield, Mass, yes. But she has a quick mind and memorizes songs and writes a poem about the Deerfield Raid. So it's an oral history. She memorizes, she writes it and passes this on, but we now credit her as the first female African-American poet in the country because of this early poem that she wrote. So that's a first for her. Then when she and her husband do have land in Vermont and move to Vermont, they're threatened by their neighbor, and she is the first African-American female, maybe even a male, the first to speak out and complain to the governor. He was sitting in Norwich, and she went to him and complained about their treatment. And he said the town has to make good and take care of her. Then she complains again on another town issue and wins again. So she's quite, Lucy Terrapin, quite remarkable. And it was very hard to get this material. Gretchen Holbrook Gersina had to just go through all kinds of archives with her husband Anthony. And I do encourage you to read Mr. and Mrs. Prince, and many of my students do read Mr. and Mrs. Prince, because it's a wonderful story
I thought she
for life.
actually argued the case in front of the Vermont Supreme Court.
Yes, she did that as well.
Right.
Yeah, and won. So she's a wonderful story. And as Gretchen says, she's one of the most important Vermonters and should be remembered by really everybody.
It was in Guilford, and Gretchen knows the land, but she will not divulge where it is.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Because it's still, it's inhabited by people, and she doesn't want to disturb their privacy, so knows where they lived.
But I think one road is named for Bijah Prince.
Yes.
Yeah. So people can see. So they might be kind of.
They might be able to.
Yeah, they might be able to figure that out. Yes, sir.
It may be beyond the scope of your talk this evening, but is the role of Quakers, in terms of civil rights within Vermont, both in terms of slavery, Underground Railroad, have you been able to kind of come up with more information?
Well, the Robinsons are Quakers. Yes, the Quakers are great on everything. Quakers are great on abolition. They're great on women's rights.
Yeah.
They're terrific. It's a small group. It's not a giant group in Vermont, but yes, and the Quakers were the ones I think you could say were the strongest in abolition work in Vermont, and they sort of had their little underground railroad and helped each other. And I think we'll see more of that in this exhibit this summer at Rokeby. Matter of fact, she told me it's opening in a few days, the Rokeby exhibit. So we'll see more of that. But that's the Quaker history that most of us connect with Vermont, is that area, Ferrisburg, Charlotte, that whole area had Quakers, and they really walked the talk. They refused to buy anything made by slaves. They wouldn't have sugar. They used maple syrup. They would not use cotton. They made their own clothes from hemp, I think. They refused to have anything to do with slavery because, most Northerners did not do that. Most Northerners used anything, didn't think about it or whatever. But yes, the Quaker history is wonderful, and those of us who teach women's history, I teach Vermont history and women's history, have quite a long essay on the Quakers. Quakers really broke open all of that for women, for blacks. They were fearless. Lucretia Mott, they were unbelievable, the Quakers. And we should explain the reason, because in the Quaker societies, women were equal. There's a reason why the Quakers were so good on this. And of course they're pacifists, and that's very important too. So, yeah, the Quaker part of American history should be told over and over. I feel strongly about it. And I have many Quaker friends too. Okay, other questions, comments? Well, thank you for inviting me.
Thank you.